Good evening, everybody. This is Katje. I welcome you to my video channel again. This evening I want to get back to basics, and so I decided to wear my black and white Peter Pan dress with these leather black thigh-length boots because I think that in the last video perhaps I got a little bit off track. So what I want to do is just first very briefly model this outfit for you. I love this outfit because it's very sharp, mostly black, but with a little white trim around it. So it's a really good outfit to wear when you want to find clarity, or at least I like to wear it in order to find clarity. So let me talk a little bit about that, and I promise that I won't go on too long about it. So last time I was talking a little bit about the concept of synchronicity. In particular, that album by the Police named Synchronicity, Sting, who wrote most of the tracks on that album, was inspired by this concept. So I was talking about that a little bit, and I think in my last video I had promised to tell you a story based on this notion of synchronicity, but the girl wants to change her mind. I don't think I want to do that now. And the reason I don't want to do it is because I don't really understand what synchronicity is, as I explained last time. And so, because I don't really understand what it is, I don't really feel that I can use it to tell a story based on that concept that I don't understand. And I worry that whatever I come up with that I'm calling synchronicity in that story isn't really going to be whatever that's supposed to be under Jung's original interpretation, which again I don't understand. So I'm going to forego that. I'm not going to do it. And instead, I'm going to return to the topic that I discussed in a number of my recent videos. I'm going to get back to some theological issues. I want to tell you a little bit about what I've been thinking in connection with those issues recently, so I hope that you will find it interesting. But I'm going to be honest, and I know some people probably won't like it. That's okay. People are entitled to their opinion. But I have to be true to myself, and I think I need to talk about the things that I find interesting and that I want to share with you. So let me just very briefly summarize what I've been thinking about in connection with those issues recently. So remember that this new view, this new theological conception that I developed in a few videos ago that's based in Kierkegaard, remember that it's very important to this new view that our relationship to God, our relationship to divinity, has to be grounded not so much in human reason and thinking, but more in human freedom and human emotions. I want to talk a little bit about that this evening. So, for example, remember that one of the aspects of this view is that God isn't really actual for me unless I'm inspired by certain stories that I hear about or read about that are drawn from the Bible. I'm not going to summarize those stories again because I did that in quite a bit of detail before. So if I'm deeply and passionately inspired by those stories, then my inspiration is the same as the paternity and affiliation that's involved in this kind of threefold divinity. And so since those three things come together and my inspiration is real, so are those things real for me. God is real for me, but that is dependent upon my having these very passionate feelings. Or, to take another example that I discussed in connection with this view, God doesn't really have any moral qualities of being good or bad with respect to me, unless whether he has those qualities and which qualities like that he has, that's going to depend on how I choose to respond to the fact that God has become a human being in Jesus Christ. This human being has suffered and died innocently and then risen from the dead. The purpose that God has become a human being who suffers and then rises from the dead is that God wants me, or wants to arouse within me, sorrow over the sufferings that this innocent being is undergoing. And if once I have that sorrow, then I have to have a kind of second level reaction to it. Do I feel outraged by the sorrow, or do I feel grateful for the sorrow? If I feel grateful, then I will be united with Christ in eternity and have this eternal fellowship with Him. If not, then I will be left to my own devices with my anger or with my resentment, and that will be my punishment. So I've been over that before. I don't really want to get sidetracked on it. What I want to talk about briefly is, though, that all of this requires that I have some very powerful feelings. And somebody might say, well, do you really have any control over how you feel? Because when we see somebody, for example, that we like, or maybe that we dislike, sometimes that just kind of hits us. We don't make any kind of free will decision about how to feel in those situations, and in many other situations, arguably, where we have feelings. So why is it any different here? On the other hand, we do believe that we can control our feelings, or that we can exercise our freedom to moderate our feelings, to direct them in certain directions, maybe not to let them become overly intensive, or maybe sometimes we need to have more feeling about something and we can try to cultivate that. So I think that there is a place for our freedom, our free will, to play in interaction with our feelings in these situations. Now, what is going to help us with that? One of the things that I've been reading recently are the spiritual exercises by St. Ignatius of Loyola. So St. Ignatius of Loyola was the founder of the Jesuit order, as many of you may know, and so he wrote this book in I believe the 16th century, after he was injured in a battle. He suffered a very serious injury and was no longer able to fight, and so gradually his mind turned to spiritual matters, and he composed the spiritual exercises and became founder of the Jesuit order. Now, what's interesting in the spiritual exercises I'm discovering as I read them and study them in preparation for Lent is that within these, St. Ignatius talks about how the will and our feelings can interact. He distinguishes among three parts of the mind. There's the memory, there's the intellect, and then there's the will. And then all of this sort of overlays these passions, these emotions and feelings that we have, some of which are the ones that I've been describing in developing the new view. So how can St. Ignatius perhaps help us to learn more about how we can try to cultivate the feelings that we need to have in order for God to be real for us and in order for God to be something good with respect to us? How do we cultivate those feelings? Well, there are a couple of ways that I've already come across that St. Ignatius mentions in the spiritual exercises. One is how he discusses how the will can sort of focus our imagination on certain scenes, either in the Bible or in the lives of the saints, but we're supposed to imagine very, very vividly, for example, what was it like for Christ to be on the cross, to be suffering in this most grievous way, so that when we imagine that and it becomes vivid, then we can begin to feel not just like we're thinking about it in the abstract, but we're actually encountering it, and it's right there in our faces. The more vivid the imagination is, the more likely we are to react to it in a powerful way by feeling sorrow or feeling very, very regretful that this person is undergoing this kind of horrendous torture and suffering, which terminates in his death. So the will can then focus our attention on particular episodes quite vividly in a way that helps us to cultivate feelings of sorrow, and that's part of what we need in this calculus of feelings and emotions that's necessary, on my view, for God to be something that's real for us and also to be something that's good for us. That's one thing. The other thing that I wanted to mention briefly this evening before I stop is that St. Ignatius has a very interesting idea in that he thinks that when we're in the course of the spiritual exercises, which are supposed to take about a month, it's a spiritual discipline that is supposed to take up the practitioner under the direction of a spiritual guide about a month, ideally, to complete, although St. Ignatius does allow for flexibility depending on the person and the person's abilities, but it should take about a month of time. But during the course of these exercises, part of it is going to be calling to mind scenes of Christ's suffering, but then also we're supposed to have hope and call to mind scenes of his resurrection, scenes of or anticipations of our being united with him in eternal fellowship. Remember, that's the promise of the view that I was describing in the earlier videos, this new theological view. But then, here's where St. Ignatius says something to me that is extremely interesting. He says, the will, when we're doing this, the will, for example, when we're trying to cultivate feelings of sorrow about Christ's sufferings on the cross, the will can keep our attention focused on that so that we don't run ahead and begin to think about the joys, the resurrection and the joys of fellowship, because then we leave the feelings of sorrow behind before we're done with them. So the will can sort of keep our attention focused where it needs to be for now, so that first we can develop the feelings of sorrow, and then hopefully when we reflect on our feelings of sorrow, we can feel gratitude about that rather than outrage. And only after that can the will then begin to direct our attention to what happens after that when Christ is risen, the part about Christ being risen from the dead, after his crucifixion, after his death, then he's risen on the third day, and we begin to anticipate a joyful union with him in eternity. That comes later, but the will plays here this kind of regulative function that we need in order to cultivate the right feelings and also to make sure that we don't get them mixed up or that we have them at the right time. Now, there's a lot more, I'm hoping, that I will find in the spiritual exercises, not only to develop this theological view, but also to help me enrich and deepen my own spiritual life during the season of Lent. I really feel that I need to do that for myself personally. Other people need to make that decision for themselves. I'm not trying to preach to anybody. All I can do is say what I think I need to do. So I'm hoping to find a wealth of material here that will help me to do what I'm talking about, and also to flesh out this position that I have been sharing with you over the course of some of my recent videos. So that's what I wanted to talk about tonight. Again, this is my Peter Pan dress, and it's sort of a kind of a Sunday dress, but it also has a little bit of edge to it, especially with the boots, and so I like that. I wanted to share that with you. I hope that you will find my reflections in this video interesting, but if you don't, that's okay. Thank you for spending time with me. Thank you for your patience, and until next time, this is Katje Eckhart wishing everybody a restful and a blessed and peaceful evening. Until next time, I hope that you will enjoy that, and I look forward to talking with you more in the future if I have the chance to do that. So have a good evening. Bye-bye.